Welcome to the Virtual Center for the Study of the Constitution and Civic Responsibility, an ongoing inquiry into American political origins and evolving institutions. The Executive Director of the Virtual Center is Dr. Bill O'Brien. He's also your host for this continuing conversation. Here he is now, Dr. Bill O'Brien.
Thank you, Bob Kincaid, and welcome to a Tuesday edition of the Virtual Center for the Study of the Constitution and Civic Responsibility. Absolutely gorgeous day in the entire East, I believe, from what I heard this morning. So in the eastern part of the country, it's beautiful. They're having some horrendous rain in the Gulf area, but and some tremendous heat out in the Southwest. I heard this morning 122 degrees in Phoenix for 3 hours yesterday afternoon. They had to ground some planes. Unbelievable. Unbelievable. But anyway, it is a pleasure to be with you here in our second consecutive day here at the Virtual Center. We are beginning 30 minutes later than we do on Mondays and Wednesdays, as it has become our practice now over the last couple of years. And I do welcome you to the program. I thank you for your continued support of this program and of the Head On Radio Network. And I think like myself, you appreciate the work that Bob Kincaid and Agnes and the rest of them do there to keep the network going and keep the equipment up to date and patch and paste and duct tape and all the rest of it. But it works. And I'm so glad that it does, and I know you agree with me on that as well. We do look forward to hearing from you. We do have a phone number, and we would love to hear your thoughts or ideas or questions, concerns, fears, hopes, whatever they might be. There's so much going on. There's no question that all of us have feelings and and perspectives and positions on some of the issues of the day. So we have devoted a phone line specifically for the purpose of getting you on the air. So if you are inclined to get on the air and share your thoughts with us, we'd love to hear from you. I know I would, and I know our other listeners would as well. The phone number is area code 304-663-4676. 304-663-4676. If you'd like to communicate with me via email, I would love to hear from you. I know that there are some folks out there that may have something they'd like to say and may not want to go on the air themselves and are comfortable trusting me to get their thoughts or their ideas out there for reaction from other listeners, and I'd be glad to do that. If you just drop me an email, my email address is waobrien906@gmail.com. That's waobrien, OBRIEN 906@gmail.com. And I do call your attention to our Facebook page. If you go to the homepage of Facebook, to the search box at the top and type in the Virtual Center for the Study of the Constitution, you will have access. You will be on our Facebook page. And there are a number of postings that I put there in recent days. I mentioned the one yesterday. I also mentioned yesterday that I was going to try to get something on there last evening. I did spend some time on it, but I didn't finish it, so it's not up there yet. But I know that it will be over the next day or two. And let me take this opportunity because, as we frequently do on Tuesdays, we will not be taking our break at the top of the hour. Hopefully, we'll be able to go right through. And therefore, even though we are starting 30 minutes later than we do the other 2 days of the week, we can pick up 10 minutes or recoup 10 minutes of that time by not taking our break and not having to go through all the phone number and email address and all the rest of it again. So that allows us to recover about a third of the time we lose on Tuesdays and Thursdays. So let me share with you that we will not be doing a live broadcast tomorrow, Wednesday, here at the Virtual Center. This one is mine, I've got to say. I have a doctor's appointment scheduled for tomorrow. and it's at 2:00, so it's right in the middle of our program. So, and it's one of those things where you have an appointment scheduled and way out, and you really can't change it, and there are other people involved and tests. I know I had to go this past Friday and have a test, and the results of that test should be with the doctor when I arrive there tomorrow. That was the whole idea. So it's one of those things. You really can't change the appointment. So I do apologize for that. So the next time that we are back together live, then, will be the first of next week. But hopefully we can take care of a few items of business today, and I'll do the very best I can to get posted the issue that I started to work on yesterday and didn't quite finish. As part of my effort in the first couple of minutes today to kind of review or kind of remind people of what we were talking about yesterday, the issue that I will be posting on Facebook and that I have started to put something together on, related to the issue of the president and the idea of obstruction of justice, and more specifically, the implications of the president's efforts, which seem to suggest that there is an intricate link between impeachment and criminal activity. Indeed, there is. If the president is found to be guilty of any criminal activity, that obviously is an impeachable offense. But on the other hand, while criminal activity is more than likely would lead to impeachment, it's important to keep in mind that impeachment doesn't require criminal activity. And that's what we spent our time talking about yesterday, was the vague nature of the wording in Article 2 of the Constitution, specifically the phrase high crimes and misdemeanors. Basically, what the Constitution in Article 2 says is bribery, treason, and other high crimes and misdemeanors. And so the very vague nature of high crimes and misdemeanors seems to suggest that the founders, as they were wont to do elsewhere throughout the Constitution, were very, very reluctant. And I think this is a tribute to the what I think is the brilliance of James Madison, especially because he was the architect of the constitutional structure that became the focus of the Philadelphia Convention throughout the summer of 1787. Madison was never far away from an awareness that the Constitution was not government or a statement of the nation's fundamental law for a short period of time, but for the long haul, so to speak. And Madison realized that if the Constitution was going to remain relevant as time changed, as eras changed, then certain key aspects of it would constantly be under review and reinterpretation and reconsideration as circumstances changed, as the situations changed. And I think the fact that we have been able to maintain the Constitution for as long as we have, with as few amendments to it as we have, is testimony to the brilliance of this Constitution and its flexibility rather than its specificity. It is specific, or it is very specific in certain areas, but in key areas like this one, it is rather vague and open to interpretation, and that's basically the way it was intended. Consequently, if you look back through history, as we did yesterday, it is very clear that the impeaching of a president is indeed possible for behaviors which would constitute an abuse of power, which might not constitute criminal activity. And what we were talking about yesterday was the fact that the special counsel, Robert Mueller, was appointed specifically to pursue the possibility of criminal activity in whether, in fact, the Trump administration perhaps colluded with the Russians in their efforts to interfere in our election process last fall. And if they indeed did that, that would be a treasonable offense, which would obviously bring get the wheels of impeachment moving, if as it were. It's important to mention, however, that the impeachment process is that the president impeachment, remember, is the charge, not the conviction, not the guilty verdict, but the charge of high crimes and misdemeanors, bribery, or treason. And impeachment is something that is voted on by the House, and the trial occurs in the Senate. In other words, it's the Senate that determines guilt when allegations of impeachment, when impeachment is launched or is filed, as it were. The reason I say this is because one of the things that is becoming more clear as we see more and more issues related, we see more and more mention of the word impeachment. And one of the things I was saying in what I was writing last night is that we didn't hear much about the word impeachment early on in the first weeks of the Trump administration. It really came into more popular use with the public testimony a couple of weeks ago of James Comey. Once he was fired, and once he appeared in day-long testimony before the Senate Intelligence Committee with a viewing audience of some 20 million people, then it seemed to me that sparked more and more conversation about impeachment. And the point that I'm making is when people talk impeachment, they seem logically to go back 45 years to Watergate in the early 1970s. And it's a technicality, but it's very important. It seems to me the reason people do that is because when we hear the word impeachment, we think President Nixon. But technically speaking, President Nixon was never impeached. He resigned before the charges of impeachment were filed. The case against him was so persuasive and so strong that he made the decision to resign from office before putting his family and himself and the nation through an impeachment trial. So, in a sense, other than Andrew Johnson in the late 1860s, the only other president impeached was Bill Clinton. He was charged and found not guilty. So, in reality, I guess the question is, why do we tend to go back to Nixon rather than Bill Clinton when we think about impeachment today? And the answer is because Bill Clinton was not convicted. Richard Nixon was removed from office. Granted, he removed himself under the threat of impeachment. Consequently, impeachment was never officially filed. But since it resulted in a president's removal from office, it's Watergate that seems to come to people's mind almost immediately when they hear the word impeachment. The other thing that I believe we mentioned yesterday, and I just wanted to reiterate it at the beginning of the program today, is are some of the differences between Watergate and the current situation. It seems to me important to recognize that in 1972, Watergate was a crime. It was a break-in. And so the president's behavior and activities were related directly to criminal activity. No question, President Nixon was obstructing justice in pursuit of resolving criminal activity. As of yet, no criminal activity has been unearthed in the Trump situation, in President Trump's situation. At least not yet. I think a lot of people believe that criminal action or criminal activity might be there, but as yet it hasn't surfaced. The assumption is that the appointment of Special Counsel Robert Mueller will more than likely uncover criminal activity if it happens to be there. And the reality is that's Mueller's charge, is to pursue allegations of illegal or implications or possibilities of illegal activity. But the important thing to keep in mind is that if there is no criminal activity, that doesn't necessarily mean that impeachment is off the table. The founders didn't intend it that way. And the fact of the matter is, history hasn't treated it that way. And the reality is, a pattern of abusive behavior and continued violations of the rule of law have in the past constituted circumstances to warrant impeachment, even though they might not constitute criminal activity. And that's really what we spent the first hour of our program on yesterday, and that's kind of what I'm trying to get in a Facebook posting as I go. Let me also, and I don't think that we will have enough time today to do this, but I want to call to your attention recommend an article to you. It's really interesting because our good friend Wayne alerted me to it this morning. It was in yesterday's New York Times, and I can't believe I missed it, because that's usually the first place I go in the morning is the New York Times. And I usually look at what's on that opinion page, and somehow I missed this. It's an article in the series entitled The Stone. It's primarily based on philosophy to a certain degree. And I have found a number of entries in this series, which I've been comfortable bringing to us all here at the Virtual Center because I thought they were worth it. And this one is as well. And I want to alert you to it, and perhaps maybe next week we can spend a little bit of time on this when we get back together. The title of the article is, quote, "Is Your God Dead?" The author is George Yancey. It's in yesterday's New York Times, June 19th, 2017. So if you go to the New York Times and you go to the archives, it's going to ask you whether, in fact, it's within the last 7 days or not. And if you say yes, it's going to bring up all of the articles that appeared on the opinion pages of the New York Times over the last 7 days. Or, short of that, you can just go to your search engine and type in in quotes, "Is your God dead?" George Yancey. And it'll give you the link to yesterday's article in the New York Times. I think if you read it, you'll find it pretty powerful. I did. And I thank Wayne for alerting me to it, because I was pretty close to missing it entirely. And I didn't want to do that. Especially after I read it, I realized this is not one I wanted to miss. But what I wanted to spend our time on, at least at the front end of our program today, the first half hour, if you will, of our program today, is a revisit to the issue we were discussing yesterday on the issue of violence and responsibility for it. You'll recall that Bob Kincaid joined us yesterday with about 20 minutes left in our program, and it was in our second hour, the last 20 minutes of our second hour. And I thought it was a very, very healthy discussion between Bob and myself on the issue of violence and accountability for it, or responsibility for it. One of the things that I tried to make very, very clear at the outset, because I saw the minefield, I knew that there were mines all over the place in this, and that is that it could easily look like I was advocating violence as a legitimate solution to political issues or political problems. And as Bob and I got into the discussion yesterday, apparently, from a listener that I heard spoke with last evening, we seemed to send, and it was inadvertent, but we seemed to send the message, at least this person got the message, that we were coming very, very close to advocating the legitimacy of violence. And I really, once I heard that, I made the decision that we would have to revisit it, because we can't leave that hanging out there. Because I know in my own case I was not. And I believe I'm safe in saying in Bob Kincaid's case he wasn't either. We were not advocating violence as a legitimate response. What we were basically saying is there are situations which occur which leave no avenue but violence for the most frustrated, angriest of people. And it seems to me, and it seemed to Bob and I both, I believe, that it's incumbent upon those in positions of responsibility to constantly keep in mind the reality of the world we live in. The reality that there are people out there who, for various reasons, feel that they are at the end of their rope. And if in the process of making policy or enforcing policy, we allow ourselves to become so focused on what we're doing that we ignore the realities of people's circumstances who have to live with what we're doing, then when we close avenues of redress, when we make it impossible for people to seek redress, the term often uses redress of their grievances, when all roads are blocked and all other alternatives prove impossible or hopeless, then desperate people will frequently turn to violence once in their minds they come to the conclusion that they don't have anything to lose. Wisdom of policymaking, the wisdom of policymaking, it seems to me, is doing everything that you can do to make sure that people in your charge, under your governance, never reach that state of mind or that frame of mind. It's always possible. And the fact of the matter is, we know that there are individuals out there who are kind of, I guess the term would be, on the edge anyway, that are more inclined in that direction than others. But the reality is that there is responsibility associated with outcomes. Outcomes just don't happen. They just don't fall out of the sky, as it were. They are responses to events and issues and circumstances. And if we are the ones who create the circumstances, we have to constantly keep in mind that these circumstances could lead, in certain cases, to violence. And if that happens, and this was my point, and I think it was Bob's as well, if that happens, then the policy maker bears a significant amount of the responsibility for what happens. I can remember yesterday making reference to the image of Pontius Pilate, the idea of washing your hands from responsibility for what you're about, or what you all are about to do. The fact of the matter is, you can't do that. Responsible policymakers can't do that. So in a sense then, what's the solution? It seems to me, and that's what was my point yesterday, the solution is to make sure that policymakers never make policy that creates the prospect of those kinds of outcomes. A lot of this is psychological. A lot of this requires that we spend some time focusing on people's presumed reactions to what we're doing. The example we used yesterday, which is the most obvious one because it's happening right now, is the issue of healthcare legislation. If you watch what's happening in the media over the last couple of days, you can't miss what's happening in the United States Senate with healthcare. The fact that there is a small group of Republican senators who are the only ones who know what's likely to be in this healthcare proposal that they are putting together. And the leader of this operation, Mitch McConnell, president of the Senate, seems committed to the idea that a vote on the floor of the United States Senate on this health care bill is going to happen before the 4th of July recess, which is the end of next week. So basically, we're talking about a health care bill that potentially affects 1/6 of our total economy, is going to come out of the shadows onto the floor of the United States Senate and up for a vote with little to no opportunity for amendment, debate, any kind of alternative, any kind of reaction. Not only that, but all the rules of the Senate, which make this kind of activity possible, are being utilized by Mitch McConnell. In other words, all the roadblocks, all the avenues of redress that exist in the rules of the Senate are being eliminated. So, in a sense, the media has already concluded, and I heard this morning, as bad as this whole situation looks and sounds, it might actually work. Because Mitch McConnell knows what he's doing. He knows the rules of the Senate better than anybody. He knows all the options that Democrat might have to try to block this. And he's addressed every one of them to make sure that they're not available. He has created a situation which at least now seems on the surface to make blocking this legislation impossible. And if this legislation is even close to the legislation the House of Representatives passed a few weeks ago, then what we're looking at is at humongous cuts in Medicaid and 23 million Americans losing their health care. And I think every member of Congress, every member of House and or Senate can pinpoint somebody for whom the loss of their health care could be fatal. We're talking about people whose lives could be negatively impacted by this whole process. And we're also talking about the manipulation of the rules and regulations of the system in such a way that all the avenues of redress seemingly have been blocked. Under these circumstances, it could very well happen that some people, like Hodgkinson's, the guy who was responsible for the shooting in Alexandria, Virginia last Friday, could go over the deep end and finally say, this is the only alternative left that I have. I'm going to use it. Chances are, if that doesn't happen and this legislation passes, chances are that kind of scenario will happen once the cuts go into effect. Once it hits people that they are indeed about to lose their health care, or that their premiums are going to escalate to such a degree that they won't be able to afford health care anymore. In that situation, Republicans will be able to say that if you can't afford health care, that's your fault, not their fault. But the fact of the matter is, under the circumstances that are currently underway, it is their fault. That's the theme that I was trying to develop yesterday, and that's the theme that Bob and I discussed during the last 20 minutes of yesterday's program. I made mention of Martin Luther King's letter from a Birmingham jail yesterday. This morning I went back and reread that letter. I was going to take a couple of key lines and paragraphs from it and share them with you, but it seemed to me that what we said was sufficient. Basically, what King said is that a lot, and of course he was sitting in jail when he wrote this letter, and the letter is to local ministers who were the ones that criticized him for the civil disobedience that he was leading in Birmingham. And so his letter is addressed specifically to these colleagues, fellow ministers. And his point was, you seem to suggest in your criticism of me that we bear responsibility for the kinds of civil protests that are likely to produce violence. Therefore, we're responsible for the violence, or for creating a situation which could lead to violence. And King pointed out that the real violence is in the legislation that brings us to Birmingham in the first place. If the people responsible for making policy make policy which puts people in desperate situations, and these people seek redress in the face of those situations, and if violence occurs as a result, the question becomes, are the protesters responsible for the violence, or are the policymakers responsible for the violence? And as we know, there's always an effort on the part of policymakers to distance themselves from reactions, from outcome, from what might happen as a result of what they do. The fact of the matter is, you can't do that. That in part, and it's only a small part, but that in part is one of the issues addressed in the article I recommended at the beginning of today's program from yesterday's New York Times entitled, "Is Your God Dead?" by George Yancey. That's exactly what Yancey is talking about. He's not talking about the God of, as he says, the God of the philosophers or the scholars. But he's talking about the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, the God of Jacob. Basically, what he's saying is evident right at the beginning of his article, when he says, in response to his question, "Is your God dead?" Have you buried God in the majestic ornamental tombs of your churches, synagogues, and mosques? Perhaps prosperity theology, boisterous, formalistic, and mechanical prayer rituals, and skillful oratory have hastened the need for a eulogy. Perhaps by remaining in your holy places, you have sacrificed looking into the faces of your neighbor, the face of your neighbor on the street. You know the one who smells bad because he hasn't bathed in days, the one who carries her home on her body, the one who begs. Surely you've seen that unholy face. I've seen you looking away from it, making sure not to make eye contact with the unclean. Perhaps you're preoccupied with texting, consumed by work or family matters. Then again, perhaps it's prayer time and you need to face east. Or perhaps you're too focused on Holy Communion as you make your way to church. Your refusal to stop, to linger, to look into her eyes has already done its damage. And then he acknowledges, I also am guilty of missing the opportunity to recognize something of the divine in the face of the other on the street. there is created by George Yancey the framework for his article, and the reason for his question: is your God dead? Has your worship of your God become so ritualistic, so formalistic, so lacking in humanity, that at the same time you fall on your knees and pray, you somehow find it within yourself justified to ignore the needy, to ignore those in pain, to ignore the plight of what sociologists and philosophers call the other? And that's really the gist of Yancey's article. And it fits so neatly into this idea we were talking about. Can you be responsible for policies that hurt so many people and somehow believe that you can duck or avoid responsibility for what they do in response? You can't. It goes back to the idea of communication generally, communication theory. It's not what you intend that matters. It's what people hear you saying that matters. If people misinterpret what you meant, then the responsibility is on you, not them. It's up to you to be more specific, to be more accurate in what you say. Basically, I would suggest what Yancey is writing about is a level of hypocrisy that seems to govern much of our religious behavior in today's world. Not just Christians, but Jews and Muslims. We have found ways to focus on those aspects of Scripture, of truth, that we're most comfortable with, and to ignore those that we aren't. In the process, we might be violating the very basic principles of the religious faith we claim to practice. A lot of this is psychology. A lot of this involves putting yourself in the other guy's shoes, so to speak. Being able to anticipate how people are likely to respond to what you say and what you do. And if that response is unacceptable, then it's up to you to change what you say and what you expect or plan to do. Because if you don't, you bear a significant degree of the responsibility for what happens. And that's what we're into here, using with the healthcare situation as well. At the risk of confusing the situation, and I don't mean to do that, I want to try to drive home what I think are the most important aspects of this. I spent quite a bit of time thinking after yesterday's program, especially after I had the conversation on the phone about whether, in fact, yesterday's program could be seen as legitimizing violence. And I kept thinking, I went back immediately, of course, to Martin Luther King's letter from a Birmingham jail. I also went back to the issue of humanity. In my mind, I revisited Emerson and Emerson's idea of the oversoul and his suggestion that there's a bit of the divine in all of us. That within all of us as human beings, irrespective of race, color, creed, or anything else, there is an element of the divine. We are, if you think about it, we are the only way that people can come to know God. Because we believe that man is God's greatest creation. Therefore, knowing man is to know God, or to come closest to it. And if you believe this to be true, that there is an element of the divine within every one of us, then all religions would be pretty much the same, wouldn't they? They would all focus on the same major principles. And those principles would be respect for and worship of the divine, and the recognition that that divinity creates a sense, a kind of responsibility that all of us must accept and adhere to. Many of the things that we take for granted in today's society, racism, discrimination, class bigotry, religious bigotry, gender bigotry, sexual orientation bigotry, all of these things that separate us and divide us and create a situation between us and them would be gone. Everybody's religion would pretty much be the same. That's what I think we're dealing with. And if that indeed were an operation, if society was indeed organized in response to that reality, then horrendous, inhuman things that promise to hurt so many people would never even get on the table, because they would be so outlandish, so irresponsible, so alien to everything that's important in life. In teaching history for so many years, one of the issues that creates consternation always happens at the end of the American history class, toward the end. And it's the world after World War II. Principally, the Cold War, the hostility between the United States and the Soviet Union, which pretty much engulfs the world for the balance of the 20th century. And it's so ironic that here we are 17 years into the new century, and we're right back to the very beginning, as it were, to the hostility between the United States and Russia. It's like the Cold War never ended. And one of the things that I have found in teaching it over the years, particularly challenging, is that you can't begin to address the Cold War and the things that occur in the post-World War II world that are directly related to the Cold War without getting into the issue of fault, without at least addressing the issue of who's principally at fault for the Cold War. Was our fear of Soviet communism legitimate? Let me elaborate on that. Was it legitimate enough to justify the actions and the activities that we took in response to that threat? Or, on the other side of that ledger, did we or do we bear significant responsibility for much of what happened as part of the Cold War because of the situations we helped create, which sustained or supported the kind of hostile situation that existed between the two superpowers after World War II? In other words, were we justified in our deep distrust of the Soviets? Or were some of the things that we criticized the Soviets for responses to situations we created? In other words, did we set traps? Did we create situations which forced the Soviet Union to take certain actions? And then we turned around and blamed them for those actions when in fact we created the situations which caused them. If you think about it, this is the very, very same challenge or problem that the issues of violence that we've been talking about creates. Responsibility for outcomes. There's no question in the last 20 years or so of my teaching, as many of you know, I became very, very much committed to the idea of going back to the original sources, giving students the opportunity to read the sources on which the textbooks were based. Because what I quickly began to realize is that textbooks are the author's interpretation of historical facts, historical situations. And depending on the ideological leanings of the historian, different people can look at the same situation and come to alternative conclusions. And that's the message students need to get. What you see in a particular book, textbook, is not necessarily the history of what happens. It's one person's read about why what happened. But chances are that there are others whose read of that same situation is entirely different. Thus, the value of the primary sources. instead of assigning a textbook to students and making the decision as to whose interpretation of history students will walk away with, it might be more beneficial to give students the opportunity to see the sources themselves and read them critically to the point that they themselves can come to understand and appreciate the possibility of interpreting the same things in different directions or different ways. When I reached this conclusion or this point in my teaching, when I got to the Cold War, I naturally went to one of the major sources of Cold War history, which is the development or the creation of America's policy of containment. There is no textbook that we can read about the world after World War II without being forced to come to grips with America's policy of containment, as articulated by George Kennan, who used to be America's ambassador in Moscow. In 1946, immediately after World War II, as an appreciation began to surface of the threat that international communism was likely to pose to our way of life after World War II ended, more and more people came to appreciate the challenge of Soviet communism. And one of the people who probably was most knowledgeable about what made the Soviet mind operate, how it operated, was George Kennan, because he spent so much time there. And his job, his life, was spent within a Soviet environment almost exclusively. In 1946, Kennan outlined his recommendations and his analysis of the situation the United States was in a secret communique to the State Department. And in that communique, in that state paper, Kennan came up with and justified the idea of containment based on what he knew about the Soviet Union. I've got that document in my hand. If you go to the internet, you too can have it in your hand. Go to your browser, Explorer or Chrome or whatever you use, Foxfire or whatever, and type in the sources of Soviet conduct. And you will get a copy of George Kennan's communique to the State Department, in which he lays out the ideological realities of Soviet communism and then lays out what America has to do to respond to this. There's no question that Kennan's communique had an impact, because containment of communism became America's foreign policy choice throughout the balance of the 20th century. Kennan's analysis became the basis of America's policy, of the buildup of our military budget, of the significance and importance of the Pentagon and the increasing size of the defense budget. Much of what happened, much of what Americans believed from the end of World War II on is linked directly to George Kennan's paper. I'd like to share some of that paper with you. But it's very important to preface it by explaining what it is I'm trying to do. I apologize for the phone ringing in the background. In other words, there's a message here, or a rationale, a method to my madness, as it were. And let me share with you what that is, and it'll make sense. I believe that Kennan's paper was not only effective, it was so effective that it literally defined the way the United States of America looked at Soviet communism and the threat it posed from that time on. I believe that everything we thought about the Soviets, everything we expected them to do, everything we believed that they believed, is attributable to George Kennan. I believe that every action we took is in response to that intellectual reality, that truth that Kennan defined for us. In reality, because of what Kennan told us, we took certain actions because we were absolutely sure of what the Soviets were going to do in order to challenge us. And since we knew what the Soviets were most likely to do, we took actions in anticipation of their actions. We tried to block avenues of access that we believed the Soviets were sure to pursue. And it is my belief that after we did that, we left the Soviets no alternative but to do exactly what we expected them to do. In other words, we took actions which forced the Soviets to do exactly what the actions we took were designed to block. Which gets us back to the question that we've been confronting for 2 days. Is what happens in the world their responsibility, or is it our responsibility? Or is it a mix of both? It seems to me that the idea of patriotism seems to suggest the need to pin responsibility on the other guy. I would suggest that that is flawed. That's a flawed view. That's like blaming poor people for being poor. Ben Carson. Poverty is a state of mind. The fact of the matter is, Carson meant that poverty was a state of mind of the poor people, of the poor person. But the reality is, poverty may be the result of the state of mind of the people who aren't poor. we believe certain things about people who are poor, and we take actions accordingly. Thereby, we create situations where the poor end up doing exactly what we expect them to do. We are creating self-fulfilling prophecies all over the place. I think we did that in the Cold War. And that's the issue that I'd like to address for the balance of our program today, which is about 22 minutes or so. Again, my goal today is not to look at the origins and gain some understanding of the Cold War, but it's to see this as yet an additional illustration of what we were talking about today in terms of responsibility for outcomes. Kennan says, in part one of his letter, and it's extensive, it's divided into parts. And one of the first sentences he puts there to open this sources of Soviet conduct is the following. There can be few tasks of psychological analysis more difficult than to try to trace the interaction of these two forces and the relative role of each in the determination of official Soviet conduct. Yet the attempt must be made if that conduct is to be understood and effectively countered. What Kennan is saying right at the outset is that this is not easy. What we have to do is get into the heads of the Soviets, understand what motivates them, and understand how what motivates them is going to get them to take certain actions. And then it's up to us to anticipate the actions and counter those actions. In other words, you are psychologically putting the Soviet mind in a box that you control. And you are creating outlets for Soviet action that are predictable. They are so predictable that when the Soviets follow through on them, you can immediately point to them and say, see, we told you what you are intending to do and what you plan to do. It becomes a sophisticated, highly sophisticated game of international chess. It's difficult, Kennan says, to summarize the ideological concepts which brought the Soviet leaders to power. But he identifies four, and these are very familiar to most of us, I think. We all learned them in school. First, that the central factor in the life of man, Soviets believe, the factor which determines the character of public life and the physiognomy of society, is the system by which material goods are produced and exchanged. This is Marx. Materialism. Economic determinism. How material goods are produced and exchanged, the economic system, most determines the character of public life, Soviets believe. Second, that the capitalist system of production, ours, is a nefarious one, which inevitably leads to the exploitation of the working class by the capital owning class and is incapable of developing adequately the economic resources of society or of distributing fairly the material goods produced by human labor. Capitalist distribution of goods and services, communist ideology argues, is unfair at its foundation. It is the exploitation of the working man by those who own the means of production. The third reality: capitalism contains the seeds of its own destruction and must, in view of the inability of the capital owning class to adjust itself to economic change, must result eventually and inescapably in a revolutionary transfer of power to the working class. Capitalism is inherently evil and must destroy itself. And it is so ingrained in people, in the property owning group, that they can't do anything to change it. They are prisoners of their own ideological pursuit of wealth. That's all they know. That's all they're about, Marxists believe. And finally, that imperialism, the final phase of capitalism, will lead directly to war and revolution. Capitalism, by definition, is expansive, leads to imperialism, leads to the need to find new markets, new sources of raw materials. In other words, it breeds the necessity of conquest, and therefore will lead to war and revolutions. This, George Kennan says, is the basic ideological foundation of what the Soviets believe about us. It dictates everything they do in response to us, in being forced to deal with us. This is the reality that they believe drives us. And then Kennan quotes none other than Lenin. And this is the quote he cites: "Unevenness of economic and political development is the inflexible law of capitalism. It follows from this that the victory of socialism may come originally in a few capitalist countries, or even in a single capitalist country. The victorious proletariat of that country, having expropriated the capitalists and having organized socialist production at home, would rise against the remaining capitalist world, drawing to itself in the process the oppressed classes of other countries." Unquote. And then Kennan makes the comment in response to Lenin's quote: "It must be noted," he says, "that there was no assumption that capitalism would perish without the proletarian revolution. A final push would be needed from a revolutionary proletariat movement, a movement representing the workers, in order to tip over the tottering structure." And Lenin believed that in Soviet Russia, that's what the Bolsheviks were about. They were the group charged with giving capitalism in Russia that final push over the edge. For 50 years, Kennan says, since prior to the outbreak of the revolution, this pattern of thought fascinated members of Russia's revolutionary movement. They found in Marxist theory a highly convenient rationalization for their own distinctive or instinctive desires. It afforded them pseudo-scientific justification for their impatience. In other words, Marxism created the ideology which in their minds justified what they wanted to do and were preparing to do in order to seize power. That's part one. Kennan opens part two by saying, so much for the historical background. What does that spell in terms of the personality of Soviet power as we know it today? Kennan points out, from the original ideology, nothing has been officially junked. Belief is maintained in the basic badness of capitalism, the inevitability of its destruction, the obligation of the working class to assist in that destruction and to take power into its own hands. But stress has come to be laid primarily on those concepts which relate most specifically to the Soviet regime itself. Certain concepts relate specifically to what the Soviets must do within Russia in order to bring about the Marxist dream. The first concept, Kennan says, is that of the innate antagonism between capitalism and socialism. We've seen how deeply that concept has become embedded in foundations of Soviet power. Now Kennan is elaborating on what that reality means in terms of how the Soviets behave. It means that there can never be, on Moscow's side, a sincere assumption of a community of aims between the Soviet Union and powers which are regarded as capitalists. In other words, what Kennan is saying to the State Department is, because the Soviets believe this ideology, that means that they believe that there can never be a community of interest between us and them. Never. The two systems are totally incompatible, Kennan is arguing. It must inevitably be assumed in Moscow that the aims of the capitalist world are antagonistic to the Soviet regime, therefore to the interests of all the peoples it controls. If this is to be regarded as a tactical maneuver, if the Soviet government occasionally sets its signature to documents which would indicate the contrary, this is to be regarded as a tactical maneuver permissible in dealing with the enemy and should be taken in the spirit of caveat emptor. In other words, we must do whatever we must do because they can never be trusted. What Kennan is saying to the State Department is they believe we can never be trusted, therefore they will act accordingly. They will always, and I'm kind of getting away from the text here because we're running out of time. We've got less than 10 minutes left in our time together today. What Kennan basically is saying here to the State Department is that because they believe firmly, without doubt, that the two systems are compatible, they also believe that capitalism's ultimate goal is to destroy them. They believe that anything we do, anything we say, anything we propose cannot be taken seriously. If it appears that we can get along, Soviet ideology says Soviets can't afford to believe that because capitalism can never coexist with them. Everything we do has an agenda. Every proposal we make is at our own best interests, which means it's against their best interests. Everything we propose, Soviets must suspect. And basically, what Kennan is saying to the State Department is they believe this about us. Therefore, we know that everything they do in their relations with us is to their advantage because they believe that everything we do is to ours. What Kennan is saying to the State Department then is, we know because of this ideology that they can never be trusted. That no matter how much it seems that they're wanting to work with us, that we have common goals and common aims, that can never be because they don't believe that our two systems can coexist. Waving my hands around here, I'm sorry. So therefore, what Kennan's document does is pretty much dictate that our whole post-war foreign policy is built around dealing with an adversary that we can never trust because that adversary will never trust us. They will always be talking out of both sides of their mouth because they believe we are. Everything they do is driven by their belief, their faith, that everything we do is at their expense. Consequently, every action they take is going to be driven by their desire to keep us from achieving our goals at their expense. If they believe that capitalism is innately imperialistic, that capitalism seeks intrinsically to dominate the world, then that's going to cause them to seek to expand throughout the world also, because they see that as their only way to counter our need to expand. Therefore, we know that they seek to expand. We know that they seek allies. They seek alliances with other peoples. We know that they're coming, that they're going to try to take over as much of the world as possible. We know that they're going to do that because they believe that's what drives us. Consequently, we've got to adopt a foreign policy which keeps them from expanding, because we know they're going to. And that's where Kennan comes up with containment. He says at the beginning of Part 4, in light of all the above, it will be clearly seen that the Soviet pressure against the free institutions of the Western world is something that can be contained by the adroit and vigilant application of counterforce at a series of constantly shifting geographical and political points, corresponding to the shifts and maneuvers of Soviet policy. Ultimately, what the United States must do in its policy toward the Soviet Union, Kennan says, is one of long-term, patient but firm and vigilant containment of Russian expansive tendencies. Because they absolutely, without question, believe that we seek to expand, they have no choice but to expand themselves. We know they're going to do it because they know we're going to do it. And therefore, our policy must be to contain them and keep them from doing it. And I would suggest that every major action that we took, every foreign policy initiative we took, going into Korea, going into Vietnam, taking a position when China fell in 1949, rebuilding Europe under the Marshall Plan, formulating NATO and similar organizations in the Middle East and in the Pacific, designed to form a defensive ring around communism in order to contain it, becomes the absolute basis of American foreign policy throughout the end of the 20th century. And it still drives our policy towards the Russians. All you have to do is listen to what our political leaders, irrespective of party, say about Putin and about the Russians. Putin comes out of this ideology. He's a product of it. He gained his stripes in the KGB. We know that he believes this. We know that if we're in turmoil, he's laughing. We know that every time we make a slip, he's going to look for ways to gain from it. We know that he can't be trusted because we know that he can't trust us. This kind of self-fulfilling prophecy, which puts your adversaries into a position where they're forced to take certain actions, which in turn validate everything you said they were going to do. You're making them act the very way you predicted they would act, because you created the circumstances which gave them no option to do anything else but that. That's what we're dealing with. So the question, who's responsible for the Cold War? I really hope that all of us will reflect much more carefully on that question than we ever have before. Think and act accordingly as a result. The shooting in Alexandria, I would suggest the same kinds of issues and psychological principles are at play. I don't think we can say that all of the responsibility is in one camp or the other. But that plays both ways. Those who would perpetrate violence ultimately must bear responsibility for their actions. But those who created the circumstances which produced those results also must bear responsibility for their actions as well. I think when we begin to appreciate this and begin to respond and act accordingly, and begin to think about putting ourselves in the other person's place, walking in the other man's shoes, so to speak, we might end up not doing some of the things that we're programmed almost automatically to do. That's really the end of our program. It is the top of the hour. I want to thank you for your continued support for this program and for the Head On Radio Network. I also want to remind you again that we will not be doing a live program again tomorrow. Our next time together will be next Monday. Thank you so much for tuning in. I hope you have a great rest of the week. Be kind to each other, and thank you.